Back in 1941, the island of Hawaii was not a state. The island was called the United States Territory of Hawaii. Nine months before the attack of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii was basically a peaceful, busy place to be. The inhabitants went about their daily routine activities, unaware that the Imperial Japanese Navy was practicing back on their islands a sneak attack on them. The goal of the Japanese Navy: attack Pearl Harbor as seen here in this picture. 8 battleships were attacked would be Arizona, California, Maryland, Nevada, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, West Virginia. The Imperial Japanese Navy has been practicing the attack on Pearl Harbor at Hinokopo Bay. The Imperial Japanese Navy would practice their war games as seen here in this picture. Another Imperial Japanese Navy ship practicing the sneak attack in Hinokopo Bay. It would be this man, the Prime Minister of Japan at that time, Isoroku Yamamoto, to plan and give the green light for the Navy to attack Pearl Harbor. The Imperial Japanese diplomats leave Washington, D.C. without a solution to the trade problems that were great in 1941. Imperial Japan had the third largest navy in the world in 1941. Imperial Japan was ninth in economic power and was struggling to try and control the Far East areas as seen here on this map. Imperial Japan's negotiations were deterring with the U.S. in 1941. It would only be a matter of time before Japan would take drastic actions. Here is a map of how the territories for control of the oil and rubber plantations looked like in 1941. Imperial Japan needed 2 things to keep their economy going: oil and rubber. Here's a picture of the oil fields of the Dutch Far East. Oil would be needed by Imperial Japan to keep their military going and manufacturing industry alive. And here's the Imperial Japanese Army taking control of the Far East rubber plantations. Imperial Japan needed rubber to keep their army machine rolling along. Here is Secretary of State Cordell Hull walks with the Imperial Japanese envoy as seen in this picture. Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Ambassador Admiral Kishizuba Nomura. Special Envoy Saburo Karusu. The ambassador and special envoy wait outside the Secretary of State's office to deliver him a message. The message was to let the Secretary of State know Imperial Japan was breaking off the negotiations with the U.S. By the time this message is delivered to Secretary of State, he already knows Imperial Japan is lying to the U.S. about something. As negotiations broke off between Imperial Japan and the U.S., there are some 31 ships that were ordered to leave Hinokopo Bay and attack Pearl Harbor. The sneak attack was on. Imperial Japan's Emperor Hirohito at first did not agree with the plan, but worked with diplomacy first. When negotiations finally came to naught, the Emperor gave the go-ahead to attack Pearl Harbor. Imperial Japan's aircraft carrier, Sukaku, would sail along with the combat fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The attack on Pearl Harbor would be a complete surprise for those who lived there. Under the guidance of Admiral Azaraka Yamamoto, the combined fleet would take 3 weeks to reach Pearl Harbor as seen here on this map shown here. Admiral Azaraka Yamamoto would be the chief of the combined fleet to lead Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Ambassador Admiral Nomura and Special Envoy Karusu sit outside Secretary of State's office, Kudor Hall. These men wait to bring the news to the Secretary of State that Japan was breaking off the negotiations with the U.S. Little did these two men know that their Navy was preparing to attack Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nomura and Special Envoy Karusu would be giving Kudor Hall what was called the 14-part message. It was a list of things Imperial Japan wanted the U.S. to adhere to in order for both sides to avoid going to war. After Secretary of State Kudor Hall read this message, he issued this statement to the ambassador. In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions. The local newspaper even put out a warning to the residents before the attack could possibly happen. Days before the attack, the residents of Hawaii were carefree and still enjoying a peaceful life, as seen here in this picture and the next few pictures as well. Much of Pearl Harbor was at peace. Here is an aerial view of Battleship Row and how the ships were moored at dock. The next few pictures show what the battleships looked like before the attack. Battleship Arizona BB-39, named after the 48th state of the U.S. 55 officers and 860 enlisted men. Battleship California BB-44, named after the 31st state of the U.S. 59 officers and 1,026 enlisted men. 7 battle stars. Battleship Nevada BB-36, named after the 36th state of the U.S. 864 men on board. 7 battle stars. Battleship West Virginia BB-48, named after the 35th state of the U.S. and include 1,407 officers and enlisted men on board who served this ship. 5 battle stars. Battleship Oklahoma BB-37, named after the 46th state of the U.S. and include 1,398 officers and enlisted men who served on board. Battleship Pennsylvania BB-38, named after the second state of the U.S., and included 55 officers and 860 enlisted men. Battleship Maryland, BB-46, named after the seventh state of the U.S., and included some 1,080 officers and enlisted men, 7 battle stars. Battleship Tennessee, BB-43, 55 officers and 1,026 enlisted men, named after the seventh state of the U.S. Ten battle stars, 1 Philippine Presidential Citation Award. Here is an aerial view of Battleship Roll before the attack on December 7th, 1941. And the next couple of pictures are the 2 men who were in charge of this military operations in Hawaii. Admiral Husband E. Kimball, in charge of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Admiral Kimball wrote a letter to the C&O Chief Navy Officer in short suggesting this to him. I feel that a surprise attack, submarine, air, or combined, is a possibility. While the newspapers and Admiral Kimball were sounding the alarm about the imminent attack, no one was listening. Lieutenant General Walter C. Short was in charge of defense of military operations in Hawaii. General Short was the Army's man in charge of this arena. Meanwhile, the Imperial Japanese Navy keeps on sailing towards Pearl Harbor. As the Imperial Japanese Navy was getting closer to Pearl Harbor, life went on as usual for those living in Hawaii. Strict radio silence was kept for the 3 weeks as flags were used to communicate between each ship of the Japanese Navy. Back in Pearl Harbor on December 6th, there was a battle of the bands between the ships and their sailors. Life was a carefree event for this night. And there was a ballroom dancing to be enjoyed the night before the attack. Even as things appeared to be normal, time would soon show things weren't all that normal at all. The next few pictures will show some of the 31 Japanese ships involved on the Pearl Harbor attack. Vice Admiral Gucci Mikawa in charge of battleship operations. Battleship Yamato, flagship to the combined fleet. Battleship Hares. Battleship Kensma. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nuguma in charge of aircraft carrier operations. Aircraft carrier Agegai. Aircraft carrier Keiga. Aircraft carrier Soryu. Aircraft carrier Hiryu. Aircraft carrier Tsukuga. Aircraft carrier Shakuko. The Imperial Japanese Navy would use about 5 mini-submarines that held 2 men. The objective of the mini-submarines was to penetrate the harbor before the underwater fits would close and shoot off their 2 torpedoes for intended targets. Despite the fact that the Imperial Japanese Navy was heading towards Hawaii for a sneak attack, both sides negotiated right up to the last minute before war. While the Imperial Japanese Navy edged closer towards Pearl Harbor, still Admiral Yamato would wait and hope war would be avoided by both sides agreeing to negotiations. An alert should have gone out when the Soviet Russians signed a treaty with the Imperial Japanese, as seen here in this picture. In April 1941, this pact was signed and should have been a signal to the rest of the world that something was about to happen. Meanwhile, in the European arena, the war would start as 1 million German soldiers invade Poland. This happens on September 1st, 1939. Three countries would sign a pact that is known as the Tripartite Pact. Here is a list of who the Allies and Axis were along with their leaders during World War II. The USS destroyer Greer is first to be fired upon by a German U-boat, causing even more anxiety of a war in the Atlantic as well. This occurs in September 1941. Operation Barbarossa begins for the Germans to invade the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Hitler and Mussolini met together on May 22, 1939. These two men formed an alliance together between Germany and Italy called the Pact of Steel. Here is a map of what Operation Barbarossa would lead the Axis powers to invade the Soviet Union. As the Imperial Japanese Navy was moving closer towards Pearl Harbor, the following countries were moving closer towards Moscow and the Soviet Union: Nazi Germany, Kingdom of Italy, Finland, independent state of Croatia. The invasion would include the following: about 4 million soldiers involved with the Axis power. Some 600,000 motor vehicles would be used to invade the Soviet Union. This would include tanks, jeeps, and trucks. About 700,000 horses were needed to help pull different things for the Axis powers. The Germans take siege of Stalingrad, and this lasts for some 900 days before the Germans captured it. The Axis power captures Stalingrad, and this would be as far as they would get into the Soviet Union. Imperial Japanese Navy spy Takeo Yoshikawa leaves Hawaii on December 6, 1941 for the last time. He gathered information for the IJN like what shows on the following map. Yoshikawa gives a detailed account for the IJN, who used this to practice their attack on Pearl Harbor with. Time was getting short for the Americans to strike a deal with the Imperial Japanese before the attack would happen at Pearl Harbor. The news would even be worse for the Russians on the Eastern Front. As the Germans eventually captured Stalingrad, World War II's beginning was just a matter of time. In the end, however, the negotiations finally broke down as the fate of Pearl Harbor was now just over the horizon. Admiral Yamamoto receives word for the go-ahead to carry out the attack on Pearl Harbor aboard his ship, the Nagato. The Imperial Japanese Navy is now stationed some 300 miles away from Pearl Harbor, as seen here in this picture. The Japanese pilots are briefed on board the aircraft carrier on Keigai. The Japanese pilots partake of their ceremonial drink before taking off for their attack on the Americans at Pearl Harbor. At last, the time had run out for Pearl Harbor. As most of the islanders were still sleeping on Sunday morning, something was about to happen that would forever change the lives of those who lived at Pearl Harbor. The first wave of attack planes would fly off from the aircraft carrier Chuaku, as seen here in this picture. Imperial Japanese Captain Mitsuo Fushida was in charge to lead the planes to attack Pearl Harbor and attack in his plane. Years of service in the INJ, 1924 to 1945, 21 years of service. At 6:10 a.m. in the morning of December 7, 1941, the first wave of planes would take off for Pearl Harbor. The Japanese crewmen would yell these three words as planes took off. Tora, Tiger, Tora, Tiger, Tora, Tiger. Here's a picture of some of the intended targets at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The first wave of attacks. During the first wave of attacks, there were some 183 Japanese planes involved bombing Pearl Harbor. The first wave of attacks the Japanese planes took is shown here in the blue lines on this map. 0645 hours. The USS Ward finds and sinks the first mini-sub and reports it to the superiors. Opata Point, Hawaii, 0702 hours. A newly built radar was being operated by 19-year-old Private Joseph Lockhart. He reports to the officer of the day, bleeps on the radar located about 130 miles away from Hawaii, moving fast. The OOD, or officer of the day, dismisses the bleeps as B-17s coming in from the mainland. 0733 hours. Intelligence breaks the Japanese code that says they were planning on attacking Pearl Harbor. General George C. Marshall reads the report and sends the message to Lieutenant General Short at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Short would not see the message until 1500 hours after the attack was done. 0740 hours. Oahu's Kakuku Point is first sighted and attacked. 0740 hours. Wheeler Airfield is attacked. All except 3 American planes are destroyed. Only 3 American planes take to the air to defend Pearl Harbor. 0755 hours. The air raid is sounded on the islands and news reported over the radio like this one. 0810 hours. A high altitude bomber drops the first bomb onto the Arizona's gunpowder magazine. Arizona blows up and begins to sink to the bottom of the harbor. It only takes 9 minutes for the Arizona to sink and some 1,100 sailors perish. 0854 a.m. Second wave of attack on Pearl Harbor begins. 35 fighters, 78 bombers, 54 high altitude bombers. 1300 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy leaves Pearl Harbor and heads back to Japan. Imperial Japan would declare war on the U.S. the same day they attacked Pearl Harbor. On the next day, December 8, 1941, the U.S. declares war on Imperial Japan. This day shall live in infamy. Admiral Kimmel would lose his command at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant General Short would lose his Army command at Pearl Harbor as well. Thousands of lives, both civilian and military, are lost during the sneak attack at Pearl Harbor. The newspapers announced the fact that America is at war with Germany and Italy as well. Hitler declares war on the U.S. on December 11, 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor is attacked. World War II would last another 5 years. It would take some 16 million Americans, both civilian and military, to defeat the Axis power. It would take 3 great American generals and many admirals to defeat the Axis powers as well. Americans will never forget those brave sailors who gave their lives on the USS Arizona on that fateful day, December 7, 1941.